I've mentioned the Germanic legends a few times in the last few videos, and since they're important to the literary context of early medieval England, it's time to give them a proper introduction. The good news is that the Germanic legends are some of the oldest surviving literature we have from northwestern Europe. And far from being boring, they are stories of legendary duels and valiant last stands, interspersed with battle speeches and haunting poetry. These stories make up much of Europe's surviving pre Christian vernacular literary culture, and they really are a treat. The bad news is that we mostly don't have these legends. Hi, I'm Dr. Gavin Davis, and in this video, I want to talk about precisely what makes a Germanic legend, why they're so tough to work with, as well as some of the main themes and vibes of this literary culture. We'll even look at a brief example. Future videos will get into each of the stories and characters more specifically, but this will serve as more of a general introduction to the Germanic legends, which are an important but very elusive bit of medieval literary history. The Germanic legends are stories which deal with figures from a period in European history, about the 4th to 6th century CE, which appears to have been especially predisposed to generating legends since so many now famous figures, like Sigmund and Sigurd, Hrothgar, Finn and Hengist, are supposedly from about this period. Though not Germanic, even Arthur of the Britons and Cuchulainn from Ireland have their origins in this period of European history. Keep in mind, Germanic is a modern term, retrospectively applied to the broad language group that the many different cultures from this period had in common. They would themselves identified as German as they were many different tribes and people groups like the Frisians, Danes, Saxons, Utes, Burgundians, Lombards, and so many others who were constantly at war with themselves as well as everyone else, and living and migrating over a large part of Europe, not just modern-day Germany. Still, Germanic is useful as it points towards the shared language group that appears to have generated the initial stories about these legendary characters. So much for Germanic, but what about legend? Well, as mentioned briefly in another video, a legend is a traditional story whose origins are uncertain or unknown. You see, if there was ever a Dark Ages in Europe, this would be it. Not because the people in it were bad or stupid, but because we just don't know as much about the people who lived in this time and place. The period of the 4th to 6th century aligns with what is called the migration period, since this was when Germanic tribes were migrating west, filling the power vacuum left by the decline of the Western Roman Empire. They were oral cultures, who rarely wrote anything down, and most of what was written down was either by the Romans, who were frequently their adversaries, or by Christian monks and missionaries who had very little interest in recording the heathen legends of the Germanic tribes. As a result, we have very limited access to the legends about these cultures, as is about to become painfully clear. Between this and the fact that writing back then was done on organic material that can decompose, the question is less, how come we don't have more legends, and more like, how do we have any of them at all? Now, even though these legends and characters are set in the migration era in Europe, the stories we have about them come from much later. That's what makes them legends, their origins are lost. In fact, the number of Germanic legends we have kind of depends on how willing you are or aren't to include works that may have been written down, if not originally composed, hundreds of years later, and maybe even in a place thousands of miles away. Still, one of the other key unifying elements of the Germanic legends is the shared set of characters and motifs that make up their content. And in that regard, it is amazing that so many different languages and cultures came up with stories about a shared set of characters. In fact, we believe these few surviving examples to be remnants of a much larger tradition because the few examples we have from vastly different sources seem to assume their audience was already familiar with the same set of characters. So, let's turn now to the stories themselves that make up this legendary tradition. There are many later high medieval stories of the Germanic legends, but just as high medieval tales about Arthur and his knights say more about 14th century chivalric culture than 5th century post-Roman Britain, so too do these later Germanic stories say more about their contemporary literary culture than about the early medieval past. So to get closer to the oral Germanic legendary tradition, we have to look as early as we can to where the literary record gets a bit thinner. It turns out that early medieval English literary culture is responsible for preserving the oldest surviving representatives of these legends. But by the most conservative estimate, we have 5 Germanic legends, which is not a lot. And if you want to stretch that number to add even the continental sources we need in order to make sense of the 5 English sources, we still don't arrive at a big number. Let's go through the roll and you'll see what I mean. The earliest Germanic legends that survive to us in Old English are Deor, which is a short, mournful poem that mentions several figures like Irminrich and Wayland the Smith; Walder, which is a super short fragment of a poem about Walter, which also happens to mention Wieland; the Finnsburg fragment, which is another short fragment of a longer poem about the fight between Finn and Hengist; Beowulf, which is vastly longer than any other work on this list, and it also mentions Wieland, Finn, Hengist, as well as Sigurd; and finally we have Widsith, which is a very curious list poem that name drops characters from all the other Germanic legends. That's it. 2 short poems, 2 fragments, and 1 long poem. Now, just about all of these works survived in handwritten manuscripts made in England about the late 10th century, although the Finnsburg fragment was a little bit later. The poems themselves were likely composed much earlier, but precisely how much earlier is a hotly contested issue. Beowulf, for example, likely comes from the first half of the 8th century, but this has been argued back and forth. Widsith might even be the oldest of the poems, with parts of it composed perhaps as early as the 7th century, which then begs the question of, well, how much did it change in the 400 years between when it was composed and how it exists to us now? These are big questions. And, well, can you imagine being a scientist and having to work with a sample size of 5? Thankfully, there are other sources in the Germanic legends that can help us out, and some of these fill in necessary details about which we otherwise wouldn't have any clue. For example, the Old English poem Walder is so fragmented that we barely know who is speaking in the 63 lines that survive. However, we have a much better idea of the story from other continental sources, the most complete of which is a 10th century poem from Germany that was written in Latin. This poem, called Walterius, provides many otherwise missing details since it is long, and one of the only records of Walter to actually focus on the story of Walter and Hildegund. Also, it is from the 10th century, making it reasonably early. But it is clear that whoever wrote Walterius was a big fan of Virgil, and seemed to be more interested in writing a Latin epic than a Germanic one. Even though the characters are from the Germanic legend in theory, the poet tries really hard to Christianize the story and write it into the Latin poetic tradition. The general narrative provides us with important details we otherwise wouldn't have access to, but if something is so heavily adapted across language, culture, religion, and audience, can we really call Alterius part of the Germanic legendary tradition? Many will say yes, some will say no, and I'm part of the group that says it's complicated. There are many other stories that work like Walterius's relationship with the Old English Walder, but frequently these are even further removed from the early Germanic legends. Notable examples would be the Icelandic sagas, like the Volsung saga, or the German Nibelungenlied, which are about characters like Sigurd, Gudrun, and Brunhilde, people who are central to the Germanic legends. But the Nibelungenlied was written in Austria about the year 1200, almost 600 years after when these legends were probably beginning to take shape. The Volsung saga was written even later, around 1250, and even then in far distant Iceland. Can you see what the problem is? This doesn't make the Nibelungenlied or the Volsung saga bad stories. Absolutely not. They're wonderful, and stories like them are important for their own reasons and in their own contexts. But does that make them good sources on the earlier Germanic legends? These are big questions that are tough to answer, and as scholarship on this period has tried to become more rigorous and precise, emphasis is shifting away from how far back can we conjecture to what kinds of concrete things can we know with some degree of certainty. To me, this makes sense, as both a scholar and somebody who loves the beauty of an old medieval legend. Tolkien's essay on the monsters and the critics was all about missing out on the beauty of literature if you try to make it something it isn't. And if we're working with evidence, we should not mistake what we have with what we wish we had. We do know that these legends existed. And whatever the Germanic legends were, they must have been at least some kind of popular in their day. Even from the few sources we have, we can tell the legends made a big enough impact on the literary culture of Europe that the legends and their mode of storytelling were still referenced and adapted hundreds of years later across genres, languages, and cultures. And also, the works that do survive are pretty cool. Most of the surviving legends have to do with the battle deeds of famous warriors from this legendary period. Deor and Widsith are a little different. Both mention warrior figures in their own way, but Deor is more mournful and contemplative rather than narrative, and, well, Widsith is a list. Between these legends, certain names come up more than others, who we figure must have been pretty important. Characters like Hrothgar, Ingeld, Finn and Hengist, Walder and Wayland. Beowulf, surprisingly, is only mentioned in the Beowulf poem. Much of the action from these stories revolves around these warriors making oaths about how they're going to fight, encouraging their friends to fight alongside them, the fights themselves, and the aftermath of the fights. As an example, here are some lines from the Finnsburg fragment. I will for sure cover the Finnsburg story in more detail in a later video, so this is just a teaser. Still, what I want to draw attention to here are the relationships between the warriors, how the poem illustrates the materiality of battle, and the general vibes. At this moment, a speaker, who is probably Hengist, is describing the battle around him and encouraging his warriors to the fight. Fugelas singeth, gulleth greiramma, guthwuduch linneth, shield shefton quith, nu sjuneth this mona, wadalander woknum, nu arisath wea dada, that this ne folkes nith fremman willath. Akan wak nieth nu wigand minne, habath Jorlinda, hitcheath on Ellen, winnath on Ord, wesath unmoda. Birds sing, the grey-coated one yells, battlewood rumbles, and shield answers shaft. Now shines this moon wandering under the sky. Now arises woeful deeds, which intends to bring about the enmity of this people. But awake now, my warriors, take your linden shields, focus on courage, struggle at the point, be of one purpose. We can see a few important tropes from the Germanic legends even in just this bit of the Finnsburg fragment. For example, we see Hengist, the leader, marshal together his men by encouraging them to fight together and to think on Ellen, which is the concept of valor that was central to this literary warrior culture. This is a pretty good representation of the traditional social structures that defined a warrior leader's relationship with his men. The lord was supposed to lead by example and distribute the treasure taken in battle amongst his loyal warriors. In turn, these warriors were supposed to make promises of loyalty to their lord and fulfill those promises by following him into battle. In a way, these Germanic legends can offer a glimpse of the idealized traditional warrior culture that would be referenced throughout the literature of early medieval Northern Europe. Another thing that stands out to me is how up close and personal the battle is. While other literature of this period might describe combat in more general terms, this poetry creates a sense of the battle by stringing together really specific details into kind of a patchwork of moments from which you can get a sense of the overall scene. Notice how much attention is given to the sounds of battle, as Hengist describes the crying of the birds overhead and the rumble of the wood as arrows strike the shields. The close specifics of this language heightens the intensity of the battle, almost like a close-up camera shot in the chaos of a fight. It is striking poetry, in that this sense of battle is transported to us over hundreds of years is, to me, awe-inspiring. At the same time, did you notice how it's a little spooky? A little grim? The legends mostly focus on legendary warriors and their famous fights, but it would be a mistake to say that they exactly celebrate the violence. In fact, one of the running themes of the Germanic legends is how the need to behave honorably often results in people doing awful things to one another. Perhaps the most memorable trope of the Germanic legends that illustrates this point is the beasts of battle motif. Did you notice how the poet gave attention to the birds? Well, one of the common recurring motifs from the Germanic legends is for the iconic beasts of battle, the raven, the eagle, and the wolf, to show up sometime before, during, or after a battle. These are carrion animals who feast on the slain. When they show up, the mood of the poem shifts towards the ominous and the foreboding, and their presence shows that far from having a burly attitude of roar, roar, violence good, warrior smash, these poems were viscerally aware of the costs of warfare, and were thinking carefully about what's left after the battle. In a way, this is part of how the Germanic legends fit into some of the broader themes of Old English literature, which spent a lot of time mourning how bleak their violent world was. So there's much more I want to say about these works, but the specifics of each of these legends are best left to their own videos, which I'm sure will come out in due time. Because the Germanic legends are important background for lots of the other works I want to cover on this channel, I wanted to create this more general introduction to the legends early on. So to conclude, I want to end this discussion with 3 important points. First, the Germanic legends are a part of a literary history that we know existed, and that was relatively important, even if we don't know a whole lot about what these legends were besides what a bare few sources and their much, much later cousins can tell us. But even if we are missing many of the Germanic legends, the emphasis I would place is on gratitude for what we do have rather than on a sense of loss for what we don't. You don't know what you don't know, but the Dark Ages become a little less dark when we can appreciate the poems that have survived a millennium to be with us today. Second, even though the Germanic legends that survive to us are few in number, we can readily see the impact they had on the broader medieval world. When I was researching my dissertation on 10th century English literary culture, the references to either these legends or their mode of storytelling would crop up in the most surprising places. King Alfred mentions Wieland in his translations of Boethius. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle directly fashioned some of the West Saxon kings in the model of these legendary warriors, and even biblical stories from the Old Testament, like Exodus and Judith, were reimagined in Old English literature with tropes from the Germanic legends. In this way, these legends offer a rare glimpse into an almost lost but profoundly important vernacular literary culture. Finally, the Germanic legends offer a pretty brutal lesson about precision in scholarship. The fragmented nature of this literary record makes the timeline of this history tricky to get right, and the allure of recovering lost legends has invited in a lot of shady scholarship. For example, it might not come as a surprise to you to learn that a fair few nationalist scholars in early 20th century Germany wanted to ignore the ethnic diversity within the Germanic legends and played fast and loose with the history to arrive at a version they thought they could put the Aryan stamp on. This has resulted in, to put it mildly, a vexed, critical history that has taken a lot of work to unpack, and this process of analyzing our methods and motives for studying this period is a process that is still ongoing. Which brings me back to definitions and being clear with what we're talking about. I stumbled into the Germanic legends in my studies because I wanted to find the earliest representations of magical swords in the literature of medieval England. And these legends are a significant part of the hazy history of medieval Europe that lies literally just beyond what we can know. As Tolkien might put it, like an echo over the hills from a time long ago. And if we're realistic about what it is we can know and the kinds of claims we can make about a period of literature, well, then we're on solid analytical ground and can make some real progress in uncovering the beautiful literary history of the Middle Ages. As always, thanks for joining me in this discussion. I feel like in these early videos I've had to do a lot of book reviews and general introductions, and believe me, there is a lot more of that coming. Ultimately, though, the goal is to move beyond introductions to get to the crunchy analysis of the texts themselves. In fact, I released this video to buy me more time while I wait for some critical editions of my favorite medieval battle poem to arrive in the mail. If you want to join me in this exploration of old books with swords in them, be sure to subscribe. I'm glad to have you along. Until then, I'm Gavin the Medievalist, and I'll see you next time.